Hi, I'm Brandon Neely with the Civil War Institute, and I'm happy to host today's notable historian interview. Today, I'll be talking to Dr. Ann Twitty from the University of Mississippi about her book, Before Dred Scott. Dr. Twitty is an associate professor and chair of the undergraduate committee at the University of Mississippi. She received her bachelor's degree in political science from George Washington University before receiving her master's and doctoral degrees in history from Princeton. Dr. Twitty's work has focused on slavery in the law and 19th century American and social cultural history. Her resume is much too long, I would say, to adequately describe in this introduction, but it includes being a member of the University of Mississippi Slavery Research Group, the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on History and Context, and the author of Before Dred Scott, Slavery and Legal Culture in the American Confluence, 1787 to 1857. I've got my nice copy here with plenty of highlights and notes. Before Dred Scott, the subject of today's discussion, was published by the Cambridge University Press and draws on the freedom suits filed in the St. Louis Circuit Court to construct a groundbreaking history of slavery and legal culture within the American Confluence. Dr. Twitty, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. Let's dive in.
Sure.
And I want to start really right at the beginning with the acknowledgments of your book. So in the acknowledgments, you mentioned that you didn't originally plan to be a historian of slavery or the law before you were introduced to this digitized collection of freedom suits. What was it about the suits that drew you in as a researcher and historian, and what caught your eye?
This is a great question, and I think one of the reasons that I was really excited about this question is because I think it gets at the weird journeys, the weird kind of intellectual journeys that we can all go on, and that I think I want to encourage people to really embrace. So I went to graduate school thinking that I was going to be a women and gender historian. I went to Princeton to work with Christine Stansel, and she was my advisor. But it was Chris who actually introduced me to the collection of freedom suits that were filed in St. Louis. She knew I was a Midwesterner. She knew I was interested in working on the history of Missouri. And, you know, I had the opportunity to dive into these freedom suits for a research paper that I wrote in a class for her. And I just kind of fell in love with the kinds of intimate, small stories that could be told as a result of this collection. Now, not every freedom suit can be kind of fleshed out in this way. Some of the freedom suits are pretty scanty on information, but other freedom suits, especially freedom suits that contain petitions that are often in the voice of enslaved people, even if they're not the formal authors of those documents, or freedom suits that contain these depositions, this testimony of people who knew the person who is suing for freedom, give you a lot of really vivid detail, I think, about 19th century life and about the institution of slavery. And, you know, we don't always get tremendous glimpses of that particular story. So I was in love with the notion that these sources were going to give me an opportunity to talk about ordinary people with a kind of source base that really hadn't been mined to date.
Yeah, the introduction to specific sources, even in my own work, just as a college student, is always kind of my entry to a specific topic. Is I'm thinking I'm going to do this, I'm really excited about that, and then I find a picture or a document or some digitized. I'm like, okay, this is it for now. Like let's dive in. I love that. That's your same way of accessing it. For the audience.
I was just letting yourself be surprised about the sources is a key part of being a historian and responding to the evidence as you find it, not the evidence as you think it's going to be, or maybe even you want it to be, but what it actually is, and that can take you on these different trajectories that you certainly didn't anticipate.
Yeah, I know that there's kind of the Gary Gallagher-esque, like, follow the evidence and you'll work out just fine.
Right.
Was there anything about the Freedom Suit digitized collection that surprised you or that moved you in that way, apart from saying maybe you don't want to be as gender focused as you originally thought?
It's interesting that you asked about gender, because one of the surprises of working with this collection of freedom suits is that it is disproportionately women who file suit. That was a bit of a surprise, and in some ways, in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense, because there are so many women who are able to pursue this route, and if they are able to obtain their freedom, then their children will be able to obtain their freedom as well. And suing for freedom, unlike running away, doesn't entail maybe the same kind of risks. So we know, for instance, that if we look at the total population of runaway slaves in the United States in the antebellum era, it is disproportionately male. And men often have, opportunities to work off the plantation more often than women. They don't have small children that they're responsible for taking care of. And so there are greater opportunities for men to escape the institution of slavery in this particular way. So these freedom suits are kind of a response, I think, to that, right? They're women's avenue, not exclusively, but they are often women's avenue to stay put while nevertheless pursuing freedom. So I think that was a bit of a surprise. I certainly didn't go into this research thinking that I was going to wind up telling the story of as many women as I ended up telling.
Certainly. For the audience, would you be willing to summarize a little quickly what were freedom suits, and then what do they teach us about both freedom and unfreedom in kind of the pre-Civil War American society?
Sure. So freedom suits are these lawsuits that are filed by people who are held as slaves. And the entire question is, are these people rightfully slaves, or in fact, are they entitled to their freedom? So they're essentially suing to answer a question about their status. And in the early period of US history, shortly after the Revolution, there are a lot of these freedom suits that are filed along the Eastern Seaboard. And some of those cases result in the end of the institution of slavery in various states. So this is what happens in Massachusetts. There are freedom suits that are filed by people held as slaves in Massachusetts that ultimately lead the Massachusetts Supreme Court to overturn the institution of slavery as a whole in Massachusetts, to declare that it's incompatible with the new Massachusetts state constitution. A little bit later, and in the period that I focus on in the book, what we find is freedom suits that are pursued, kind of in much more individualistic fashion, right? Courts are no longer making these kind of sweeping decisions about the institution of slavery and their compatibility or lack thereof with state constitutions that, for instance, suggest that all people are entitled to freedom, or suggest that all people should receive a certain modicum of rights. So we see these lawsuits that are filed by individual people held as slaves. They sue for a wide variety of reasons. The most common reason that enslaved people will sue for their freedom in St. Louis is because they have been held as slaves on supposedly free soil. So let's say they'd been born somewhere along the Eastern Seaboard, maybe in Virginia, and at some point, they'd accompanied a master, or they were sold, and they were transported into Kentucky, and then for a time into Illinois. They stayed in Illinois for a period. Illinois is supposed to be a free territory or a free state, and then they proceeded on to Missouri. That's the most common basis that the folks that I write about are using as the grounds for their particular suits. But other folks will claim, for instance, that they'd been previously entitled to their freedom because a former master had freed them in their will, for instance, but they just hadn't been set free. Or there are a very small number who sue on the basis of being descendant from Native American tribes who are west of the Mississippi River. And supposedly Native Americans couldn't have been enslaved west of the Mississippi River, right, according to Spanish law. So there's going to be a couple of different legal bases for these suits, but they're all basically claiming their freedom on an individual basis. I think that these suits really can tell us a lot about the various strategies that enslaved people use to try to obtain what is most valuable to them. And what is most valuable to them depends, right? Sometimes it might be de jure freedom. What they're truly seeking is an end to their enslavement. I think in a lot of cases, in a lot of the freedom suits that I work on, what enslaved people are truly seeking is some stability in their lives. And maybe that stability is going to come in the form of securing their freedom and becoming a free person. But most importantly, they want to stay put in St. Louis, and often they really care deeply about maintaining these familial or friendship bonds that they've developed in St. Louis. And filing a freedom suit might be a way to obtain that stability, or at least a shred of that stability and that kind of autonomy over, their own kind of life choices. Because even if they aren't successful, They might delay a sale outside of St. Louis's jurisdiction. They might persuade a master that that they can work out some kind of private bargain, private deal, where eventually they will be freed, and so their enslavement will come to an end, even if the court case, again, is not successful or doesn't necessarily look like it's going to be successful. So these freedom suits are a kind of bargaining tool, I think, that enslaved people use to try to seek their own will, right? To try to obtain this modicum of control over their lives.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that first reason why somebody might file a freedom suit. But first, as a little addendum to that piece, how successful were the freedom suits? Did we see a bunch of success, or was it people had to try 6 or 7 times before they won?
There definitely is this sense that if you filed multiple suits, you were more likely to be successful, slightly more successful. But I think one of the other real surprises of this collection of freedom suits is that the plaintiffs were successful in, I think, a large number of cases. It's slightly over 40% of freedom suit plaintiffs eventually obtain their freedom through the courts as a result of these freedom suits. That is to say, they obtain jury decisions or higher court decisions declaring that they are no longer enslaved. It stands to reason that there would be others who, again, worked out maybe those kind of private bargains with enslavers, essentially saying, rather than continuing to pursue this in court and run up costly legal fees, what if we make a private deal whereby I'll continue to work for you for a certain period of time and you agree to free me at an eventual moment. So there are private negotiations that I think are always happening kind of subtly off stage here in these cases. But this success rate, I think, is quite high when we think about the 19th century legal system as generally one that wasn't particularly interested in the rights of Black people, and certainly the rights of enslaved people.
One of my favorite challenges of your work is that there's kind of the numerical victory of just over 40%, and we have this kind of formal litigation that says yes or no, or yes in this way, and the challenge is, what are the other victories that we have to infer? I think there's a woman who won her 3rd freedom suit in Springfield, Missouri, which is just a couple minutes north of where I live, and she wins and becomes free, and in the coming weeks is pulled out of her home and beaten, and so it's fun as a challenge to historians. Obviously, it's not a fun subject matter at all, but it's an interesting journey to take a look at all these things and say, what does freedom mean? What does not freedom mean? And what does victory look like for these people?
No,
I particularly enjoyed that.
You're absolutely right, and the story of Millie Sawyer's is one that I've continued to learn more about. The book that you write is always kind of fixed in a moment in time, and in the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to revisit a couple of these cases, both in other things that I've been writing, and also because I was contacted by, I'm actually a native of Springfield, Missouri, and Springfield, Missouri is where Millie Sawyer's ultimately winds up. And it was a reporter for my hometown newspaper who didn't know that I was a Springfield native, who had Googled Millie's name, and my book came up as a hit, and it had asked, what I knew about, her life before she winds up in Springfield. And then that opened up this whole world of, researchers and archivists in Springfield who had been working to flesh out Millie's story there. And that was it was a really exciting experience for me, because there was such an intensely interested local audience for this information. I remember getting invited to present on a panel at the Library Center, a place that I went when I was a kid. And I agreed to do it over my spring break. And so I drove up to Springfield, and I thought, I'll be lucky if there's 10 or 15 people in the room. And I showed up, and there were, I think, 100, 150. It was standing room only. And I think that's one of the real delights too of when your work intersects with a particular local interest. Here were people who were, living in Springfield, interested in the history of Springfield. They weren't professional historians, right? I wasn't talking to an academic audience. I was talking to just an interested subset of the public. And historians don't get nearly as many opportunities, I think, to talk to those folks as maybe we would like. And it also, I learned a lot more about Millie as well. So many of the stories I feel like that I told even in the book, right? You can continue digging, and digitization is making available so many additional pieces and parts of these stories. And I think so it's a really exciting time to be a historian. It makes you worried that whatever you've committed to writing isn't the authoritative final word, but is just a way station along the way. But it also means that you can find out so much more about some of these folks than you once could, because increasingly so many localities and corporations, are digitizing newspapers, are digitizing local court indices. And all of a sudden, a really distinctive name can be searched for on Google, and you can find a real treasure trove of additional information. So I hope people will continue working with this collection of freedom suits. I'm not tired of them yet. I still find them fascinating. So I think there's still a lot to learn.
Yeah, I've been doing research for the Civil War Institute about Wilson's Creek, the battlefield near Springfield. Right. And there's a woman who lives on the battlefield that I've been trying to chase down through the records. And my kind of my cheat code for doing that research is that I will look up those Millie Sawyer's articles, because it will name drop, Connie N from the archives and this historian and this person. And then I just grab those emails. It has been my kind of little, you helping me out in a way that, of course, you had never heard of me and I had never heard of you at the time.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. It's like these webs of names and kind of connections, whether that's connecting to librarians or archivists who are rock stars and I think don't get celebrated enough, but who love to find somebody who really wants to know more about their subject, or finding the names of these historical figures. And that's how I've made a lot of the connections that I've been able to make through simple Google searches. So and finding out more all the time. So it's like you can run a search in March and you can run the same search in November and get additional results potentially. So I think it's a really exciting time to be interested in doing this kind of submerged history or an intensely kind of local history, because digitization is slowly but surely spreading to so many different places, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I live in Ozark, just south of Springfield, so I'm also a nice Missouri native, and it's good to be talking to a fellow Missourian. And so when you talk about the intersection of your academic work and the local kind of communities that really attach themselves to this, it's particularly interesting. Your book focuses on the American Confluence, which deals a lot with the region that we both lived in, and a section of the U.S. that's showing up more and more in professional research into the Civil War. You say that it's defined by its fluidity. So for the audience, how would you define the American Confluence? And then what makes it unique, and what opportunities exist for researchers in this region of the U.S.?
So when I say American Confluence, I am shamelessly borrowing that phrase from Stephen Aaron, a professor at UCLA who I learned a lot from, who has a book called The American Confluence. He uses that term to specifically talk about the place where the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers meet. I enlarge it a little bit to include the Ohio River as well. So I'm basically talking about this area where the three of the greatest waterways in the United States drain into the center portion of the continent. And it's absolutely true that this has not been a part of the United States that I think has up until now received a ton of attention. And yet I think really can be revealing for some of these larger questions that historians have been wrestling with for a long time. So one of the things that makes this region distinctive, if you're interested in understanding slavery, is we ultimately know that the territories and states that are north of the Ohio River get declared free territories and states as a result of the Northwest Ordinance and the working out of the Northwest Ordinance in the 19th century. And we know that the states and territories that are south of the Ohio River become slave states, slave territories. But even though we kind of have this bifurcated understanding of this particular region, if we're thinking about the late 18th century and we're thinking about the first part of the 19th century, what we really find is that the people who were living there are constantly traversing this Ohio River, right? They're constantly traversing this boundary that supposedly exists between slavery and freedom. And the kind of labor system that grows up in this region is similarly kind of complex and murky and ambiguous, because there are all kinds of Black people in this part of the country. Some of them are going to be free. Some of them are going to be enslaved. Some of them are going to be indentured servants, right? A category that I think in most of our minds probably died out, in the 17th century Chesapeake, but reemerges in the late 18th and early 19th century. And it creates what I call radical indeterminacy of status, which is a kind of complex way of saying a real mess in terms of sorting out who is enslaved, who is a free person, who is an indentured servant. And I think that creates possibilities, right? Anytime that the boundaries are not, in fact, as hard and fast as we imagine, anytime that they're kind of fuzzy around the edges, what we get is opportunity and room to negotiate, to maneuver, and sometimes that works out to the benefit of Black people who inhabit this region. Sometimes it works out to their tremendous detriment. But it is, I think, an interesting, revealing story. And we tend to think about that region as being, part free and part slave, but the reality in the late 18th and early 19th century is a lot more complicated than that. And I think it's also really just this kind of meeting point for the nation. You have a lot of people kind of traveling through this particular part of the country on their way from one place to another. Often enslaved people are brought into this supposedly free soil, which gives rise to a whole series of freedom suits, not just the ones that I've been talking about kind of generally so far, but also most famously the Dred Scott case, right? The Dred Scott case grows out of this kind of conceptual murkiness about the institution of slavery. And I guess maybe the last thing that I would say is that one of the things that I love, and I associate this with the 19th century, although it may honestly be true for just about any period in any place that you could find, it feels as though this world is sparsely enough populated in some sense that you constantly have kind of the same weird cast of characters popping up here and there in these really idiosyncratic kind of ways. And so, when you look through this collection of freedom suits, one of the greatest surprises is finding out that the same person who gives a deposition in this case is later sued by a different plaintiff, 5 years later, and shows up as a witness in yet a third case. And it's thinking about those kind of webs of relationships and connections. Sometimes all of those connections are in St. Louis itself, and sometimes they're flung out over hundreds of miles that kind of cover the American Confluence. So thinking about how information and knowledge is traveling is also, I think, something that's really of interest to me in thinking about the American Confluence and what makes it distinctive.
Yeah, that idea of that as a region, not only as let's focus on a place that we don't talk about as often or much, is fine. But I especially like the idea that it is the place where a lot of those borders become murky, not just the state borders of. There's a story that I'm sure you will bring up with the next question that takes place within a river, and they're trying to figure out where the jurisdiction of different rivers lie, but also with thematic borders. We use the terms freedom and unfreedom, and they sound kind of silly at first, but really kind of saying that the walls we've built as historians or that we've built as a society are not as kind of opaque as we originally thought. That idea about the American Confluence and that broader theme that literally travels across the region, as did the people, as did the ideas, is so much fun to me. And I think part of the strengths of the book is that that's the region it travels in. I'd like to bring up that next question, although I think I know the answer. There are, like you said, a nice cast of characters throughout the book. Hugh mentioned we get to dive in through whatever historical ways we have to talk about these people. Is there a specific person or event or story from the book that comes to mind for you?
Well, I'm glad you asked this, and you know, the book in many ways is a book of stories. The second part of it, you know, is a series of case studies, these kind of micro histories that I relish in telling, and that I had such an interesting, complicated, fun time trying to reconstruct and trying to kind of come up with. But you're right that my absolute kind of favorite anecdote to emerge from the book is the anecdote that I opened the book with. And obviously it's hard to come up with an opening anecdote. You want an anecdote that's going to illustrate, you know, some broad themes in the book. And I thought this anecdote captures it brilliantly. It's the story of a whole bunch of different types of people, which is central, I think, to the conceit of the book, who come together to try to come to an understanding about the law and what the law means, and how one might skirt the law, and how one might use the law in order to get something that you want. And that is the story of this slaveholder who's been sued by a person who's been held in slavery. His name is Vincent. So Vincent is suing his master. And Vincent's master paddles out into the middle of the Mississippi River because he has gotten word that he's about to be served, and he thinks he's going to be served with an order that's going to result in the forfeiture of Vincent, or he's going to be taken into custody. He's not really sure what exactly this order is, but he knows that it's bad, and he's going to try to evade it. And his solution for this is to paddle out into the middle of the Mississippi River and to stay in the middle of the Mississippi River when the sheriff's deputy arrives, until he's given, you know, sufficient assurances that in fact he's not going to be taken into custody, right? And I think this gets at the kinds of legal knowledge that ordinary people had, right? We often think that, you know, it's only lawyers who really kind of have an understanding of the finer points of law, who have a sophisticated reckoning of how you use the law. And I think what this anecdote suggests is that, you know, ordinary people are also imbibing these ideas about the law. They're using these ideas about the law to structure their behavior, their actions, to try to get what it is that they want. And sometimes they get the details, you know, pitch perfect, and sometimes it's a little bit lost in translation and they do some kind of wacky things. But all of it, right, is a kind of recognition that the law has tremendous power to affect their lives, and that they need to be savvy manipulators of the law, that they operate in the shadow of the law, and so they best understand what it means for them. So that's one of my favorite stories. But honestly, you know, one of the other reasons that I enjoyed working with these cases so much is because people are people, and when given the opportunity, you know, in a deposition, for instance, to opine about something, will sometimes say the strangest, wackiest, but also sort of most human things. And then I think that's what, you know, sitting here from the position of the 21st century allows you to actually understand who these people were as people, and how, again, how they were understanding, you know, what it meant to give a deposition, or what it meant to be a witness in a courtroom, or to sit on a jury, or to sue somebody in court. And I love those kinds of moments where people don't feel like prim and proper historical actors, but instead feel very much like the kinds of people that we encounter in our own daily lives.
Yeah. I am not a student of law. I'm not trying to do a pre-law route at school. I don't read a ton of legal history. And so as I started the book, you know, I have it in my hands and I'm looking at the title and thinking, this is going to be really fun. I'm really way out of my league, where it's going to be this dense, really erudite legal history. And while it is very academic and of course incredibly well written and researched, I thought that those moments where it talks about the non-lawyers and kind of the people's understanding of the law was really effective, and blew me away as a reader and as a student of history, to say that there are parts of this that we lose oftentimes when we think about kind of the nature of law. One of the explanations that made it make the most sense to me was to say that, you know, a poor family living in a one-room house, living paycheck to paycheck, is not going to be a set of, you know, kind of the prim and proper lawyers you might expect, but will know very well what it means to be evicted and how long they have to stay, and kind of that comparison. And so thinking about it in that way helped me to understand much more that this guy in the middle of the Mississippi River, as other people are paddling out to say, like, you can come back, it's a comedic moment there, right. But it's because there's an aspect of humanity that we can sometimes forget in the search of the broader thematic principles. I really, really enjoyed that section, and frankly, just wanted to hear you tell that story again.
Oh, hey. I love this story, and honestly, until I figured out that it would be so fitting for the introduction, it was one of these amazing stories, and this happens when you write a book, that you have these stories that feel so perfect, and they're so interesting, and you've thought about them for such a long period of time, and yet sometimes it feels like, oh, where am I even going to put this, right? Where does this even belong? And there are still, there's still more that, that are on the kind of cutting room floor, but that I do still kind of think about and reflect on. And I think a lot of people get maybe kind of scared off of doing legal history. And I'm not going to lie that the learning curve for learning how to read legal documents is really steep. It's very hard when you first get started to make sense of these kind of formal legal documents that make up a large percentage of the Freedom Suit case files. But then there are these depositions, which don't feel necessarily like formal court proceedings, instead feel like people just, with a microphone in front of their face, kind of talking about, the facts as they perceive them, or recalling events that took place, many, many years ago, and all the funny things that memory kind of does, and how you remember something, right? And I think that, I come at this with, I mentioned at the outset that I was, interested in working on women and gender history, also, deep social historian roots. I have always been kind of fascinated with, these kind of tales of ordinary people and the kind of details of exactly how 19th century life worked in a really kind of material way. And so I think that commitment, I think, led me to do certain things with these freedom suits. There've been a couple of other historians who worked on these freedom suits as well. And different historians will create different histories, even if they work from the same general source set. So to me, the details are often some of the most revealing bits, and some of the parts to kind of revel and delight in. And I'm glad to hear that came through.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to ask one last question about the book, and it's actually a little bit more of a question for you, like, that you'll have to ask. A lot of times people will talk about their books and get the same 6 questions about what the heck is the American Confluence and what is a freedom suit. In all the time that you've been talking about the book, is there a question that you've been hoping somebody would ask that you wanted to talk about or answer?
You know what, actually, I've been a little bit surprised that I haven't gotten more questions about lawyers. The lawyers are I think such a weird set of actors in this story, and I think there's such a strong inclination maybe to think about lawyers who participate in this suit as having a kind of overt ideological agenda. And I talk about this in the book. Some of them do. There's some evidence that some of them are at least somewhat committed to an anti-slavery project. But there are also these others who don't really seem to be participating in these freedom suits in order to strike a blow against slavery or to prop slavery up, right? They're simply trying to get paid, and this is a particular moment in 19th century history before the kind of large corporate retainer exists. And so even prominent attorneys in the West in particular are scrapping for every little bit of business that they can often find. And so you also get like really prominent people participating in, I think there's often this perception that it's going to be kind of the 19th century equivalent of ambulance chasers, who are the only people who are going to represent these enslaved people. And in fact, in St. Louis, it's some of the most prominent members of the bar. Edward Bates, for instance, who goes on to be Attorney General of the United States under Lincoln, represents both slaveholders and enslaved people in these suits. A Senator, Henry Geyer from Missouri, also represents a number of individuals. So they're a kind of really interesting crew, and I suspect there's a lot more work to be done on them too, them and I think judges, because a lot of them eventually become judges. But thinking about how formal legal actors are conceptualizing what these freedom suits are is a really interesting question. You know, the book is primarily interested in what ordinary people think about these freedom suits and how they are using those freedom suits. But that same question, I think, looks very different when, you know, your primary actors are attorneys or judges rather than, you know, slaveholders or enslaved people.
Yeah. The area that I live in and you came from, I think provides a great way to understand how all of those people kind of factor into modern understandings, or at least some of the memory of those people, and in a space that's continually growing. So Springfield obviously is the site of where Millie Sawyer's files and then is beat. There is a movement here in Springfield that I'm sure you're aware of to either rename a part of a street to her, to rename a park, and to make sure that she's kind of remembered by name, because one of the men who beats her is the founder of Springfield, or at least known as the founder of Springfield, and has some sections of street named after him. And so there's issues of competing memory. Just south of Springfield is Branson, which has some sense of kind of common knowledge, but it resides within Taney County, which is named after Roger Taney, who of course hands down the decision in the Dred Scott decision. We live, I think at times, particularly with legal histories, it feels like this thing was decided a long time ago and, you know, it's whatever. And it's especially meaningful within the American Confluence to be not just at the intersection of all these things happening, but at the intersection of those things happening and having meaning today.
Right. Well, and I think a lot of, you know, when I first started working on these freedom suits in 2010, you know, we weren't having the same conversations nationally about race and racism and the legacy of white supremacy that we currently are having, and that I certainly welcome. And that changes who your audience is, I think, and sometimes that can change the types of projects that feel meaningful and important to you. But it's been a tremendous joy for me to find a broader audience for some of these historical, you know, they started out as kind of academic historical questions, but they turn out to be, you know, relevant or of interest to sort of a much broader population, and they lead to these questions about, you know, what do we do when we actually know this? What do we do when we've actually internalized some of this information? So, you know, whether it's Millie Sawyer's in Springfield and the question about whether or not there should still be a Campbell Street named after John Campbell, which is one of the most prominent streets in Springfield. You know, I think these questions then necessarily engage the audience, and I think they're great questions to be asking. And I think regardless of where you come down on, you know, whether or not street names should be renamed or whether or not monuments should be relocated, I think having the conversation is really, really important. And it's part of being honest about our past. And I would honestly say, I also think that it's a part of, you know, actually being a kind of patriotic American. People, I think, find that a kind of strange claim. But, you know, we often hear this talking point that American history isn't doing enough to inculcate love of country. And I would say quite the opposite. I think if you truly love something, then that means that you have to understand it. And I think what we all search for in life is someone who will love us and understand us for who we are, not for who they want to imagine us to be, right? That we don't want to live our lives on a pedestal, that we actually want to be appreciated for our failings and our ability to overcome those failings. And that's part of, I think, reckoning with these difficult, uncomfortable aspects of our nation's history. It's a part of having a kind of mature adult conception of what it means to appreciate your country. And so I wish that there was, you know, universal acclaim for those impulses, but I certainly think that there is you know, a much broader audience for these kinds of conversations than there once was. And that leads to, you know, questioning on a whole bunch of things. And I think that's an important process. And I think it's a good process anyway, right? For us all to learn to just sit with sometimes unpleasantness, right? That's good training on an individual level for life, because life comes with a bunch of disappointments. I think it's a good training for citizens in terms of sort of how to think about the nation and what it means to actually love something and care for it. I hope that as these conversations continue and more people get involved or exposed to some of these conversations, I hope they come to recognize, I think, the value of them.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing I can say in response to that that's going to be better put than you said it. So I think that's a great place to wrap up, especially with the charge to introduce yourself and to be willing to stay within those kind of uncomfortable moments. Part of the reason I found this work so valuable and part of the reason I was so excited to get to speak with you today is because it jumps kind of feet first into, man, it's messy, it's dirty, it's frustrating oftentimes, not just in terms of the subject matter, right? The idea of freedom suits as a whole are really, really sad as kind of modern readers, but also the challenges as a historian to go through and write this. Even as more items are digitized in the way that you were describing, there's so much that we don't have and won't have, that to jump into that space where it says, I don't know what's going to happen on the back end, but I want to be in it.